The rain hammered against the tall windows of the Whitmore estate, each drop a tiny fist demanding entrance into a world that had long ago locked its doors to anything resembling humility. Inside, beneath the glow of a crystal chandelier that cost more than most people earned in a year, Margaret Chen knelt on the hardwood floor of the pantry, her weathered hands clasped together, her lips moving in silent prayer. She had no idea that on the other side of the door, 3 pairs of eyes watched her through the crack, their faces twisted with barely contained laughter. She had no idea that her simple act of faith would soon shake the very foundations of everything the Whitmore family believed about power, control, and the invisible forces that govern human destiny. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves through the streets of Ashford, Connecticut, a town where old money whispered its superiority through manicured lawns and iron gates that kept the world at a comfortable distance. The Whitmore estate sat at the end of Beacon Hill Road, a sprawling Georgian manor that had housed 5 generations of Whitmores, each one adding another layer of wealth and another degree of separation from the struggles of ordinary people. The house itself seemed to look down on the town below, its white columns standing like sentries guarding against the intrusion of anything common or unrefined. Margaret Chen had lived in the small room above the garage for nearly 8 years. She was 52 years old, though the years had been less kind to her than they might have been to someone who had not spent 3 decades cleaning other people's homes, raising other people's children, and swallowing her own dreams so thoroughly that sometimes she forgot she had ever had any. Her face was round and gentle, marked by lines that spoke more of patience than bitterness, though she had every right to the latter. Her hair, once thick and black as midnight, had gone gray at the temples, and she kept it pulled back in a simple bun that never varied from one day to the next. She had come to America from Taiwan when she was 24, following a man who had promised her a better life. That man had disappeared within 2 years, leaving her alone in a country where she barely spoke the language, where her nursing degree meant nothing without expensive recertification, and where the only work she could find was the kind that made her invisible. She cleaned. She cooked. She cared for children who would grow up never remembering her name. And she prayed. Margaret prayed every morning before dawn, kneeling beside her narrow bed in the room that smelled of motor oil and old wood. She prayed every evening after the dishes were done, standing at the small window that looked out over the estate's tennis courts and swimming pool, features she was welcome to maintain but never to use. She prayed over meals she ate alone at the small table in the pantry, thanking God for food that was often the leftovers the Whitmores did not want. Her faith was simple, unadorned by theology or ritual. She talked to God the way she might have talked to a friend if she had any, sharing her worries, her loneliness, her small hopes for a future that seemed to recede further with each passing year. The Whitmore family found this habit endlessly amusing. Victoria Whitmore was the matriarch, a woman of 65 who wore her wealth the way some people wear armor. She had married into the Whitmore name 40 years ago, and she had spent every day since then ensuring that everyone understood the significance of that fact. Her hair was always perfectly styled, her clothes always impeccably tailored, her pearls always real. She moved through her home with the certainty of someone who had never questioned her right to everything she possessed. She was not cruel by nature, but she was profoundly indifferent to the inner lives of people she considered beneath her station, and she considered most people beneath her station. Her son, Richard Whitmore, was 42 and had inherited his mother's sense of entitlement along with the family's investment portfolio. He was a tall man with the kind of good looks that had been carefully maintained through expensive dental work and a personal trainer who came to the house 3 times a week. Richard worked in finance, though his work mostly consisted of moving money that had been made by previous generations of Whitmores from one account to another. He had never struggled for anything in his life, and this lack of struggle had left him with a peculiar form of contempt for those who had. His wife, Vanessa, was 38 and beautiful in the way that required constant maintenance. She had come from a family with money but not quite enough money to satisfy her, and marrying Richard had been a calculated decision that she had never regretted. She spent her days shopping, having lunch with friends who were equally bored and equally wealthy, and managing the household staff with the kind of casual cruelty that came from never having to consider the consequences of her words. She had firing Margaret at least a dozen times over the years, usually for infractions so minor that they evaporated as soon as they were spoken, but Victoria always intervened. Good help was hard to find, Victoria would say, and Margaret knew her place. The youngest member of the family was Olivia, Richard and Vanessa's daughter, who was 16 and had learned from her parents and grandmother that the world existed primarily for her convenience. She was pretty in an unremarkable way, with long brown hair and the kind of figure that would have been considered healthy in any other context but which prompted her mother to leave articles about diet and exercise on her bathroom counter. Olivia was not stupid, but she had never been required to work hard at anything, and this had left her with the impression that intelligence was something you either possessed or did not, like blue eyes or straight teeth, rather than something that had to be cultivated through effort. It was Vanessa who had first noticed Margaret's prayers and had pointed them out to the others. They had been in the kitchen one morning when Vanessa had gone to get cream for her coffee and had found Margaret kneeling in the pantry, her eyes closed, her lips moving soundlessly. Vanessa had returned to the breakfast table with a smile on her face that suggested she had just discovered something delightful. "She prays," Vanessa had said, her voice filled with the kind of wonder usually reserved for observing the behavior of exotic animals. "Our Margaret actually prays. Can you imagine?" Victoria had looked up from her newspaper, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. "What does she pray for, do you suppose?" Vanessa had shrugged. "I don't know. Probably that we'll give her a raise. Or that her lottery ticket will finally hit. You know how these people are. They think God is some kind of cosmic vending machine. Put in a prayer, get out a miracle." Richard had laughed at that, a short bark of amusement. "It's rather pathetic when you think about it. All that time wasted talking to someone who isn't there. If she spent half as much time working as she does praying, maybe she wouldn't be a housemaid at 50. From that day forward, Margaret's prayers had become a source of entertainment for the family. They would time their trips to the kitchen to coincide with her prayer sessions, watching through the crack in the pantry door, stifling their laughter. Vanessa began to make jokes about it at dinner parties, regaling her friends with stories about the superstitious maid who thought that mumbling to the ceiling would change her circumstances. Even Olivia, who might have possessed a shred of empathy if it had ever been encouraged, learned to roll her eyes whenever she heard Margaret whispering her thanks before meals. Margaret knew they mocked her. She was not deaf, and the walls of the Whitmore house were not as thick as the family seemed to think. She had heard them laughing. She had seen the smirks they exchanged when they thought she was not looking. But she did not stop praying. Her faith was not something she had chosen because it was fashionable or because it made her life easier. It was simply part of who she was, as essential as breathing, and no amount of mockery could take that away from her. On a gray Tuesday in late October, Margaret knelt in the pantry as she did every evening after the dinner dishes were washed and put away. The Whitmores were in the dining room, lingering over dessert and coffee, their voices carrying through the house with the casual confidence of people who had never worried about being overheard. Margaret folded her hands and closed her eyes, letting the familiar words rise from somewhere deep inside her chest. "Dear God," she whispered, her voice so soft that it barely disturbed the air. "Thank you for this day. Thank you for my health. Thank you for this roof over my head and the food you provide. Please watch over my sister and her children back home. Please help them through their struggles. And please, if it is your will, help me find a way to see them again before I get too old." She paused, swallowing against the tightness in her throat. It had been 6 years since she had been able to afford a trip back to Taiwan. 6 years since she had held her sister's children, who were no longer children but young adults she would barely recognize. The money she sent home each month left almost nothing for savings, and the cost of airfare kept rising, an impossible mountain she had long ago stopped trying to climb. "Please give me strength," she continued. "Help me to be grateful for what I have and not to dwell on what I don't. Help me to see your goodness even when things are hard. And please, Lord, help the Whitmore family. Help them to find whatever it is they're searching for. Help them to know peace. She stayed there for several more minutes, her breathing slow and steady, her mind quiet in a way it only ever was during these moments. When she finally opened her eyes and stood up, her knees aching from the hard floor, she felt the same small measure of peace she always did after praying. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was not happiness, exactly, but it was enough to carry her through another day. She did not know that Vanessa had been standing outside the pantry door for the last 5 minutes, recording her on a smartphone. She did not know that the video would be shown to Victoria and Richard over coffee the next morning, provoking gales of laughter. And she certainly did not know that her prayer for the Whitmore family, offered with such genuine sincerity despite everything they had done to demean her, would be the beginning of something none of them could have anticipated. The next morning dawned cold and bright, the kind of autumn day that made everything look sharper and more defined. Margaret woke at 5:30 as she always did, dressed in the same gray uniform she wore every day, and made her way down the narrow stairs from her room to the main house. The kitchen was still dark when she entered, the only light coming from the small bulb above the stove that she had left on the night before. She moved through the familiar routine without thinking, starting the coffee maker, taking eggs and butter from the refrigerator, setting out the china that the Whitmores preferred for breakfast. By the time Victoria came downstairs at 7:15, the table was set, the coffee was hot, and the smell of fresh biscuits filled the air. Victoria sat down without acknowledging Margaret's presence, unfolding her napkin and reaching for her coffee cup. Richard appeared a few minutes later, already dressed in his suit, checking his phone as he walked. Vanessa was last, wearing yoga clothes that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly salary, her hair pulled back in a ponytail that had taken her 20 minutes to make look casually perfect. Margaret served them in silence, placing plates of eggs and bacon in front of each person, refilling coffee cups, removing empty dishes. She had perfected the art of being invisible, moving through the room like a ghost, present but not intrusive. It was only when she was back in the kitchen, washing the breakfast dishes, that she heard Vanessa's voice rise above the murmur of conversation. "Oh, you have to see this. I recorded it last night. It's absolutely precious." Margaret's hands stilled in the dishwater. She heard the sound of a video playing, heard her own voice speaking the words she had whispered in the pantry. Then came the laughter. It started with Vanessa's high-pitched giggle, then Richard's deeper chuckle, and finally Victoria's more restrained but no less amused laugh. "She prays for us," Vanessa said, her voice thick with mockery. "Can you believe it? After everything, she prays that we'll find peace. As if we're the ones with problems." Richard's voice followed. "It's almost sweet in a simple-minded sort of way. Like a child wishing on a star." Victoria spoke next, her tone more measured but no less condescending. "It's the ignorance that's truly sad. She genuinely believes that her prayers have some effect on the universe. That somewhere up there, someone is listening to a housemaid's wishes and rearranging reality accordingly." Margaret stood at the sink, her hands submerged in cooling water, her eyes fixed on nothing. She had known they mocked her, but hearing it laid out so plainly, hearing the contempt in their voices as they discussed her faith as though it were a mental deficiency, something inside her shifted. Not her faith itself, which remained as solid as ever, but something in how she saw them. For years, she had told herself that their cruelty came from ignorance, that they simply did not understand what it meant to need God because they had never needed anything. But listening to them now, she realized it was not ignorance. It was arrogance. They believed they were gods themselves, masters of their own universe, and the idea that something existed beyond their control, something that did not care about their money or their name, offended them on a fundamental level. She pulled her hands from the water, dried them on a towel, and continued with her work. She would not stop praying. If anything, she would pray harder. Not because she expected to change them, they were beyond her capacity to change, but because she knew her prayers changed her. They kept her human in a place that seemed designed to strip away her humanity piece by piece. The days that followed fell into their familiar pattern. Margaret worked, the Whitmores lived their lives of comfortable excess, and the weather grew steadily colder as October slipped into November. The mockery continued, sometimes subtle, sometimes overt. Vanessa would make comments about prayer being the refuge of the powerless. Richard would joke about how much time Margaret wasted on her knees when she could be doing something useful. Even Olivia, who had once shown occasional flashes of kindness, seemed to have fully embraced her family's attitude, rolling her eyes whenever Margaret bowed her head to say grace over her solitary meals in the pantry. But then something happened that none of them expected. It started small, so small that at first no one noticed. Richard came home from work one evening in mid-November, his face pale, his movements stiff. He went straight to his study and closed the door, emerging only for dinner, during which he barely spoke. When Vanessa pressed him about what was wrong, he waved her off with an irritated gesture. "Just a rough day," he muttered. "Market volatility. Nothing to worry about." But Margaret, serving the meal in her silent way, noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand shook slightly as he reached for his wine glass. She noticed, and that night, she prayed for him as she always did, asking God to give him wisdom and peace, even though he had spent that very morning making fun of her prayers to a colleague on a phone call she had overheard. 2 days later, Victoria received a call from her doctor's office asking her to come in for a follow-up on some recent blood work. She scheduled the appointment with the casual assumption that it was routine, nothing to worry about, but Margaret saw the flicker of fear in her eyes when she hung up the phone. That night, Margaret prayed for Victoria's health, asking God to watch over her, to heal whatever might be wrong, to give her comfort. A week after that, Olivia came home from school with red eyes and a defeated slump to her shoulders. She went straight to her room without speaking to anyone, and at dinner, she pushed food around her plate without eating. When Vanessa demanded to know what was wrong, Olivia finally admitted that she had failed a major exam, one that would significantly impact her GPA and potentially her college applications. Vanessa launched into a tirade about responsibility and effort, about how Olivia had everything handed to her and still could not manage to succeed, and Olivia fled from the table in tears. That night, Margaret prayed for Olivia, asking God to help her find her way, to give her the strength to face challenges, to show her that failure was not the end but a teacher. Margaret did not pray these prayers expecting anything to happen. She prayed them because it was who she was, because her faith taught her to love even those who despised her, to bless even those who cursed her. She prayed them and then went about her work, scrubbing floors and washing windows and preparing meals, invisible and unremarked. But God, it seemed, had other plans. Richard's rough day at work turned into a rough week, then a rough month. The market volatility he had mentioned was actually a full-blown crisis in one of his major investments. A company he had poured millions into, acting on what he considered his infallible instinct, was embroiled in a scandal. The CEO had been arrested for fraud, and the stock price was in free fall. Richard spent hours on the phone with lawyers and accountants, his face growing more haggard with each passing day. The loss would not bankrupt him, the Whitmore fortune was too vast and too diversified for that, but it was significant enough to sting, and more importantly, it was a blow to his ego. Richard Whitmore did not make mistakes. Richard Whitmore was smarter than the market. Except, apparently, he was not. Victoria's doctor's appointment revealed elevated markers that suggested possible early-stage cancer. They needed to run more tests, the doctor said, using the carefully neutral tone that medical professionals employ when they want to convey seriousness without causing panic. Victoria left the office in a daze, and for the first time in decades, she felt the cold finger of mortality tap her on the shoulder. She, who had spent her entire adult life believing that money could insulate her from anything unpleasant, suddenly faced the reality that there were some things money could not buy, and one of them was a guarantee of tomorrow. Olivia's academic struggles continued. The failed exam was followed by others. Her teachers began sending concerned emails. Her college counselor had a serious talk with her about adjusting her expectations, about considering schools that were less competitive. For a girl who had been raised to believe that she deserved the best of everything simply by virtue of being a Whitmore, this was a devastating blow. She began to withdraw, spending hours alone in her room, scrolling through social media and comparing herself to peers who seemed to have everything figured out. And Vanessa, who had prided herself on maintaining an image of perfection, found that image beginning to crack. Her closest friend, another wealthy housewife with whom she had lunched and shopped and gossiped for years, abruptly stopped returning her calls. Vanessa eventually learned through the grapevine that the friend had been offended by something Vanessa had said at a party, some casual cruelty that Vanessa did not even remember but that had cut deeply enough to end a friendship. Other friends began to drift away as well, and Vanessa found herself increasingly isolated, attending events alone, eating lunch by herself at restaurants where she used to hold court. The Whitmore house, which had always hummed with the confident energy of people who believed themselves untouchable, began to feel heavy and strained. Conversations at dinner were terse or non-existent. Richard snapped at Vanessa over trivial things. Vanessa took her frustrations out on Olivia. Victoria moved through the house like a general surveying a battlefield after a defeat, her usual composure showing cracks. And through it all, Margaret continued to pray. She prayed as she made breakfast, as she swept floors, as she folded laundry. She prayed for each member of the family by name, asking God to be with them in their struggles, to give them strength and wisdom and peace. She prayed even though they continued to mock her, even though Vanessa had shown the video of her praying to several friends, turning Margaret's most intimate moments into entertainment for people who had everything except empathy. It was early December when Victoria finally broke. She had received the results of her additional tests, and while they showed that the elevated markers were not cancer after all but a treatable condition, the scare had shaken her profoundly. She found herself unable to sleep, lying awake at night staring at the ceiling, thinking about mortality and meaning and all the things she had spent a lifetime avoiding. One morning, she came down to breakfast to find Margaret already there, setting out the usual china, pouring the usual coffee. And for the first time in 8 years, Victoria really looked at her. Margaret was humming softly as she worked, a hymn in Mandarin that Victoria did not understand but that carried a melody of surprising sweetness. Her movements were efficient but not rushed, and there was something in her posture, a kind of quiet dignity that Victoria had never noticed before. This woman, who had every reason to be bitter, who worked long hours for modest pay, who endured mockery and condescension without complaint, seemed somehow at peace in a way that Victoria, with all her wealth and privilege, had never been. Margaret turned and saw Victoria watching her. For a moment, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Margaret offered a small, gentle smile, the kind of smile that expected nothing in return, and went back to her work. Victoria sat down at the table, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something that might have been shame. The morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor, and in those shadows, Victoria began to see the outline of something she had been missing her entire life. She did not know what it was yet. She did not have words for it. But she felt its absence like a physical ache, a hollow place inside her that no amount of money or status had ever filled. Margaret finished setting the table and quietly left the room, leaving Victoria alone with her thoughts and her cooling coffee. And in that solitude, Victoria Whitmore began, for the first time in her privileged life, to wonder if perhaps there was something to be learned from a woman who spent her mornings on her knees, talking to a God that Victoria had long ago dismissed as the invention of people who needed comfort because they lacked her advantages. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, marking time that suddenly seemed more precious and more fleeting than it ever had before. The December wind howled against the windows of the Whitmore estate, rattling the glass in its frames as though demanding to be let in. Inside, the house that had always felt impenetrable now seemed fragile, as though the walls themselves had grown thin. Richard sat in his study surrounded by papers and laptop screens showing red numbers that seemed to multiply each time he looked at them. His investment losses had deepened, spreading like a stain across his portfolio. What had started as a single bad decision had exposed other weaknesses, other miscalculations he had made while operating under the assumption that his privilege would always protect him from consequences. He had fired his financial advisor the week before, shouting accusations across a conference room while his colleagues watched in uncomfortable silence. The advisor had taken it quietly, gathering his things with the weary expression of someone who had seen this coming. As he left, he had said something that stuck with Richard like a splinter under the skin. You never learned to listen. You thought you knew better than everyone, and now you're paying the price. Not just in money, but in everything else too. Richard had dismissed the words at the time, but they kept coming back to him in the quiet moments, which were becoming more frequent now that people at his firm had started avoiding him. He had always believed that confidence was the same thing as competence, that acting like he knew what he was doing was indistinguishable from actually knowing. But the market, indifferent to his self-image, had revealed the truth. He was not as smart as he thought. He was not as invincible as he had believed. And this realization ate at him with the persistence of acid. One evening, as Margaret was clearing away his untouched dinner from the study, Richard looked up at her with bloodshot eyes. His collar was loosened, his tie discarded somewhere on the floor. He looked, for the first time since Margaret had known him, like a man who had been defeated. "Do you really believe it works?" he asked suddenly, his voice rough. "The praying. Do you honestly think someone up there is listening?" Margaret paused, a plate balanced in her hands. She had learned long ago not to engage with the Whitmores on matters of faith, knowing that any response would only invite more mockery. But something in Richard's voice stopped her from offering her usual neutral deflection. He was not asking to make fun of her. He was asking because he genuinely wanted to know. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "I do believe it." Richard laughed, but there was no humor in it. "How? How can you believe that when your life is what it is? You work yourself to the bone for people who don't appreciate you. You live in a room above a garage. You haven't seen your family in years. What exactly has God done for you that makes you think he's paying attention?" Margaret set the plate down gently on the edge of his desk. She was silent for a moment, choosing her words with care. "He gives me peace," she said finally. "Not the kind that comes from having everything I want. The kind that comes from trusting that I am seen, that I matter, even when the world tells me I don't. He gives me the strength to keep going when everything feels hard. And he reminds me that I am more than what I do for a living, more than how much money I have or don't have." Richard stared at her as though she had spoken in a foreign language. "That's enough for you? Just feeling like you matter?" "It has to be," Margaret said simply. "Because it's the only thing that no one can take away from me." She picked up the plate again and left the study, leaving Richard alone with her words. He sat there for a long time after she had gone, staring at the numbers on his screens without really seeing them. He had spent his entire life accumulating things that could be taken away: wealth, status, the good opinion of others, and he had never once considered what it might mean to have something that could not be lost. The idea unsettled him in a way he could not name. Across the house, in the master bedroom, Victoria sat at her vanity removing her makeup with slow, mechanical movements. Her reflection stared back at her, and for the first time in years, she looked at herself without the filters of self-deception. She saw the lines around her eyes that no amount of expensive cream could erase. She saw the tightness in her jaw from years of clenching her teeth to keep from saying what she really thought. She saw a woman who had built her entire identity on being better than other people and who now faced the possibility that she had been wrong about what better actually meant. The health scare had passed, but its shadow remained. Her doctor had told her that stress was a major factor in her condition, that she needed to find ways to relax, to let go of control. The suggestion had seemed absurd at the time. How could she let go of control when control was the only thing that had ever made her feel safe? But lying awake at night, her mind racing through endless worst-case scenarios, Victoria had begun to wonder if her need for control had actually made her less safe, not more. She had spent 65 years building walls to protect herself from vulnerability, and those walls had become a prison. She thought about Margaret, who had every reason to be angry at the world, who had lost her parents, been abandoned by her husband, been forced to start over in a country that had shown her little kindness. And yet Margaret moved through her days with a lightness that Victoria envied. It was not that Margaret had no burdens. It was that she seemed to have found a way to carry them that did not crush her. Victoria had never been a religious person. Her family had attended church when she was a child, but it had been a social obligation rather than a spiritual practice. She had long ago dismissed faith as something for people who needed a crutch, who could not face reality without the comfort of imaginary protectors. But lately, she had begun to wonder if perhaps she had been the one avoiding reality. What if the material world she had devoted herself to was not the whole story? What if there was something else, something deeper, and she had spent her entire life skating across the surface, never daring to look down into the depths? She finished removing her makeup and stood up, wrapping her silk robe more tightly around herself. The house was quiet, everyone retreated to their separate corners of isolation. She walked to the window and looked out at the dark grounds, the skeletal trees swaying in the wind. Somewhere in the small room above the garage, Margaret was probably praying again, talking to a God that Victoria did not believe in about people who had done nothing to deserve her compassion. And Victoria felt, for the first time in her life, the smallest flicker of curiosity about what that conversation might sound like. Downstairs, in her bedroom decorated with posters of musicians and actors, Olivia lay on her bed staring at her phone. Her social media feeds were filled with classmates posting about college acceptances, scholarships, achievements. Everyone seemed to be moving forward with purpose and direction while she felt stuck in place, watching her future narrow with each failed exam and missed opportunity. Her mother had stopped speaking to her except to deliver cutting remarks about her laziness and lack of ambition. Her father barely acknowledged her existence, too consumed with his own problems to notice hers. Her grandmother offered occasional words of encouragement, but they felt hollow, generic advice that did not touch the specific fear that lived in Olivia's chest. She had always gotten by on being a Whitmore. The name opened doors, created opportunities, smoothed over rough patches. But now, faced with the prospect of college applications that would be judged on merit rather than family connections, Olivia was discovering that she had no idea who she was beneath the name. She had spent 16 years being told she was special without ever being required to become special, and the chickens were coming home to roost. The previous week, she had stayed after class to talk to her English teacher, Mrs. Patterson, a woman in her 50s who had taught at the private school for 20 years and who had a reputation for being fair but demanding. Olivia had wanted to ask about extra credit, some way to salvage her grade, but Mrs. Patterson had looked at her with an expression that was not unkind but was entirely without pity. "Olivia," Mrs. Patterson had said, leaning back in her chair. "You're a smart girl. But you've never learned to work, and that's not my fault. That's not even your fault. It's the fault of everyone who has ever let you slide by because of your last name. But here's the truth, when you get to college, assuming you get into one, nobody there is going to care that you're a Whitmore. They're going to care whether you can do the work. And right now, based on what I've seen, I don't think you can." The words had hit Olivia like a slap. She had left the classroom blinking back tears, humiliated and angry. But later, alone in her room, she had to admit that Mrs. Patterson was right. She could not do the work. Not because she was incapable, but because she had never developed the discipline, the persistence, the willingness to struggle through difficulty that was required for real achievement. She had been given everything except the tools to earn anything. She thought about Margaret, who she had barely noticed over the years except as a presence that kept the house running. Margaret, who had come to this country with nothing and had built a life through sheer determination. Margaret, who woke up before dawn every day and worked until night without complaint. Margaret, who had more reasons to give up than Olivia could imagine, and who instead kept going, kept praying, kept hoping. There was something in that persistence that Olivia found both inspiring and reproachful. If Margaret could keep trying in the face of so much hardship, what excuse did Olivia have for her own defeatism? She set her phone down and stared at the ceiling. For the first time in her life, Olivia Whitmore allowed herself to feel ashamed of who she had become. And in that shame, there was the smallest seed of something that might eventually grow into change. Vanessa, meanwhile, had retreated into a different kind of isolation. Her days, once filled with social engagements and carefully curated public appearances, had become empty and echoing. The friends who had drifted away had not been replaced, and she was beginning to understand that what she had thought were friendships had actually been alliances of convenience, relationships based on mutual social climbing rather than genuine affection. When she had been at the peak of her social power, people had wanted to be near her. Now that cracks were showing, now that her husband's financial troubles were becoming whispered gossip, now that her daughter's academic failures were becoming known, those same people had moved on to more promising associations. She spent hours alone in the house, wandering from room to room, touching expensive objects that no longer brought her any pleasure. The art on the walls, the designer furniture, the closets full of clothes that she had bought not because she needed them but because she could, all of it felt like the set dressing of a play that had closed, leaving her alone on an empty stage. She had built her entire identity on being envied, and now that the envy had dried up, she did not know who she was. One afternoon, unable to bear the silence any longer, she went into the kitchen looking for something, though she could not have said what. Margaret was there, preparing vegetables for dinner, her movements practiced and efficient. Vanessa stood in the doorway watching her, and for a moment, she felt a stab of resentment so sharp it took her breath away. This woman, who had nothing, seemed more content than Vanessa, who had everything. How was that fair? How was that possible? Margaret looked up and saw her standing there. "Is there something you need, Mrs. Whitmore?" Vanessa opened her mouth to say no, to retreat back to her empty wandering, but instead she heard herself ask, "Are you happy?" Margaret blinked, clearly surprised by the question. She set down her knife and considered her answer. "I have hard days," she said slowly. "Days when I miss my family, when I worry about money, when I feel lonely. But yes, I think I am happy. Or maybe content is a better word." "How?" Vanessa asked, and she could hear the desperation in her own voice. "How can you be content when your life is so difficult?" Margaret smiled, a small gentle expression that held no judgment. "Because I know that my life is not just what I see in front of me. I believe there is more to existence than the material things we can touch. I believe I have purpose, even if it is not the purpose I would have chosen for myself. And I believe that someone loves me, even when I feel unlovable." Vanessa stood there, her arms wrapped around herself, feeling as though she were on the edge of understanding something important but could not quite grasp it. "Who?" she whispered. "Who loves you?" "God," Margaret said simply. "And my family, even though they are far away. And I try to love the people around me, even when it is hard. Especially when it is hard." Vanessa felt tears prick her eyes, and she turned away quickly, not wanting Margaret to see. She left the kitchen and went upstairs to her bedroom, where she lay down on her bed and stared at the ceiling. She had spent her entire life chasing love in the form of admiration, envy, desire. She had wanted people to want to be her, to want to be near her, to want what she had. But she had never considered that there might be a different kind of love, one that was freely given rather than earned through performance, one that did not fluctuate based on her usefulness or attractiveness or social status. The idea was foreign to her, almost frightening. If love could not be earned, then it also could not be controlled. And Vanessa had spent her life trying to control everything. As December deepened and Christmas approached, the Whitmore house felt less like a home and more like a collection of lonely people living parallel lives under the same roof. The decorations went up as they did every year, expensive and tasteful, arranged by a professional service that came and went in a single afternoon. The tree stood in the front hall, 12 feet of perfectly symmetrical Norwegian spruce draped in designer ornaments and subtle white lights. It was beautiful in a sterile way, perfect and untouched, a symbol of a family that looked good from the outside but felt hollow within. Margaret had her own small tradition. In her room above the garage, she set up a modest nativity scene that she had brought with her from Taiwan. The figures were simple, made of painted clay by an artist in her hometown, and they were the only possessions she had that carried real sentimental value. She arranged them carefully on her dresser, Mary and Joseph bending over the infant Jesus, the shepherds and wise men gathered around. Every night, she would kneel before the scene and pray, thanking God for the gift of His Son, asking for peace and healing for the Whitmore family, pleading for a way to see her own family again. She had received a letter from her sister in early December. The envelope was thin, and when Margaret opened it, her hands shook. Her sister's handwriting filled 2 pages with news from home. Her nephew had gotten married. Her niece had graduated from university. Her sister's husband had been diagnosed with diabetes and was managing it but needed expensive medication. The letter was full of small joys and quiet struggles, the texture of a life that Margaret was missing. At the end, her sister had written, "We understand why you cannot come home. We know you are working hard to help us. But we miss you. The children ask about you. Please take care of yourself." Margaret had read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in a small wooden box where she kept all her sister's correspondence. She allowed herself 5 minutes to cry, then washed her face, straightened her shoulders, and went back to work. There was no use in dwelling on what could not be changed. But that night, her prayers had been longer than usual, her voice shaking as she begged God for a miracle, knowing even as she asked that miracles were not things to be demanded. 2 weeks before Christmas, something shifted in the house. It began with Richard, who came home from work one evening and went straight to the kitchen instead of his study. Margaret was there, washing dishes, and he stood in the doorway watching her for a moment before speaking. "Margaret," he said, and his voice was different, softer, stripped of its usual arrogance. "Can I ask you something?" She turned, drying her hands on a towel. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore. That night, when I asked you about prayer, you said it gives you peace. I've been thinking about that. A lot, actually. And I realize I don't have peace. I haven't had it in years. Maybe ever." He paused, looking down at his hands. "I don't know if I believe what you believe. But I was wondering if you could teach me. How to pray, I mean. Or at least, how to start." Margaret stared at him, certain she had misheard. She studied his face, looking for signs of mockery, but all she saw was exhaustion and sincerity. Slowly, she nodded. "I can try, sir." Richard shook his head. "Don't call me sir. Not for this. Just call me Richard." They sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where Margaret ate her solitary meals, and she began to speak. She told him that prayer was not complicated, that it did not require special words or training. It was simply talking to God as you would talk to someone who loved you, someone who wanted to hear your real thoughts, your real fears, your real hopes. She told him that God already knew everything in his heart, so there was no use in pretending or performing. Honesty was the only requirement. Richard listened, his hands folded on the table, his eyes fixed on her face. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I don't know if anyone is listening. But I need to say some things out loud. Even if it's just to the air." "That's okay," Margaret said gently. "You start wherever you are. God will meet you there." Richard closed his eyes. His jaw worked as though he were chewing on words too difficult to swallow. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry. For the way I've treated you. For the way I've treated everyone. I thought being powerful meant never admitting I was wrong. But I've been wrong about almost everything. And I don't know how to fix it." Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "You just did the hardest part. You admitted it. That's where change begins." Richard opened his eyes, and they were wet. They sat there together in the quiet kitchen, master and servant, 2 people who had lived in the same house for years without really seeing each other, finally beginning to bridge the chasm that wealth and pride had carved between them. Upstairs, Victoria stood outside her bedroom door, listening. She had come down to get a glass of water and had heard voices in the kitchen. She had been about to interrupt when she realized what was happening. Now she stood frozen, her hand on the banister, hearing her son speak words she had never imagined he possessed. When the conversation ended and Richard left the kitchen, Victoria slipped back upstairs before he could see her. In her room, she sat on the edge of her bed, her heart pounding. If Richard, who had been the most arrogant of all of them, could humble himself enough to ask for help, What did that say about her own pride? She had spent her entire life believing that asking for help was weakness, that admitting uncertainty was failure. But listening to her son's halting words, his admission of being wrong, she had heard something that sounded less like weakness and more like courage. The next morning, Victoria came down to breakfast early. Margaret was in the kitchen preparing coffee, and Victoria stood in the doorway in her silk robe, her hair still unpinned. Margaret looked up, surprised to see her at this hour. "Mrs. Whitmore, is everything all right?" Victoria took a breath. "Margaret, I need to talk to you. About your prayers." Margaret set down the coffee pot, her expression wary. "Yes? I've been dismissive of them. Cruel, even. I've let my family mock you, and I've participated in it myself. I told myself it was harmless, that you didn't know, but that's a lie. You knew. And you kept praying anyway." She paused, her hands twisting together. "I don't understand that. I don't understand how you can have compassion for people who have shown you none." Margaret was quiet for a moment, considering her response. "Because holding on to anger only hurts me," she said finally. "Because I believe that every person is struggling with something, even if I can't see it. And because my faith teaches me that I am called to love, not to judge." Victoria felt something crack open inside her chest. "I want what you have. I don't know if I believe in your God. But I want that peace. That certainty. That ability to forgive. How do I get it?" Margaret smiled, and there was such warmth in it that Victoria felt tears rise. "You ask," she said simply. "You ask with an open heart, and you see what happens." So Victoria asked. She sat down at the kitchen table, in the chair Richard had occupied the night before, and with Margaret's gentle guidance, she spoke her first prayer in 40 years. It was clumsy and awkward, full of starts and stops and long silences. She did not know if anyone was listening. She did not know if it would change anything. But by the time she finished, she felt lighter, as though she had set down a burden she had been carrying for so long that she had forgotten it was there. Vanessa was next. She had seen Richard emerge from the kitchen 2 nights before, his face different somehow, softer. She had noticed her mother-in-law behaving strangely, skipping her usual coffee meeting with friends to stay home, spending long periods alone in her room. Something was happening, something Vanessa did not understand, but that made her feel left out, as though everyone else had been invited to a party she had not known about. She found Margaret folding laundry in the utility room one afternoon. She stood in the doorway, watching the older woman's efficient movements, the way she handled each piece of clothing with care even though it did not belong to her. When Margaret noticed her, she looked up with a question in her eyes. "They're different," Vanessa said abruptly. "Richard and Victoria. Something has changed in them. It has to do with you, doesn't it? With your praying." Margaret folded a towel and set it on the growing stack. "They asked me to teach them how to pray. I don't know if that's what changed them, or if they were ready to change and prayer was just the tool they used." Vanessa stepped into the room, her arms wrapped around herself. "I've lost everything I thought made me important. My friends. My social standing. Even my husband barely looks at me anymore. I don't know who I am without those things." "Maybe that's good," Margaret said gently. "Maybe you get to discover who you really are beneath all the things you thought defined you." Vanessa laughed, but it was bitter. "And what if there's nothing underneath? What if I'm just empty?" "I don't believe that," Margaret said. "I've worked in this house for 8 years. I've watched you. You're capable of kindness when you let yourself be. You love your daughter, even if you don't always know how to show it. You're not empty. You're just scared." The words hit Vanessa like cold water, shocking and clarifying. She was scared. Terrified, in fact. Scared that without her carefully constructed image, she was nothing. Scared that if she let people see her real self, they would reject her. Scared that she had wasted years on pursuits that meant nothing and that it was too late to change course. "Teach me," she whispered. "Whatever you taught them. Please." So Margaret taught her. And Vanessa, who had spent years perfecting a facade of effortless superiority, found herself sitting in a utility room surrounded by laundry, speaking halting words to a God she was not sure existed, asking for forgiveness and guidance and the courage to change. It was the most honest she had been in longer than she could remember. Olivia was the last. She had watched the transformation in her family with confusion and suspicion. Her father, who had been a storm cloud for months, suddenly seemed calmer, more present. Her grandmother, who had always been rigid and proper, had started smiling more, had actually asked Olivia about her day and listened to the answer. Her mother had stopped making cutting remarks and had instead tried, awkwardly, to offer encouragement. It was unsettling, this sudden shift, and Olivia did not know what to make of it. She cornered her father one evening and demanded to know what was happening. Richard had looked at her for a long moment, then said, "I'm trying to become a better person. I'm trying to fix what I've broken. And I'm starting by learning to be honest about what I don't know." Olivia had gone to her room and thought about his words for hours. She thought about her own failures, her own fear, her own dishonesty with herself about who she was and what she was capable of. And she realized that she, too, needed to learn honesty. She went to find Margaret, who was in her small room above the garage, reading by lamplight. Olivia knocked tentatively on the open door, and Margaret looked up in surprise. "Miss Olivia, is something wrong?" Olivia stepped inside, looking around at the modest space that was so different from her own spacious bedroom. "I need help," she said quietly. "I need to learn how to be better. And everyone else went to you, so I thought maybe I should too." Margaret set down her book and gestured to the only chair in the room. Olivia sat while Margaret perched on the edge of the bed. They talked for over an hour, and in that conversation, Olivia admitted things she had never said out loud: her fear of inadequacy, her shame at her own laziness, her desperate desire to be someone worth respecting. Margaret listened without judgment, offering gentle wisdom born from years of struggle and faith. When Olivia finally left the small room above the garage, she felt different. Not fixed, she knew that would take time, but hopeful. For the first time since her life had started unraveling, she believed that change was possible, that she could become someone better than who she had been. And that belief, fragile as it was, felt like a gift. The week before Christmas, the entire Whitmore family sat down for dinner together for the first time in months. Margaret served the meal as she always did, but the atmosphere at the table was different. Richard was not on his phone. Victoria was not critiquing the food. Vanessa was not making passive-aggressive comments. Olivia was not sulking. Instead, they talked. Really talked, about their days, their thoughts, their feelings. It was awkward at first. Years of dysfunctional patterns did not disappear overnight, but there was an effort being made that had never existed before. Halfway through the meal, Richard set down his fork and looked at Margaret, who was refilling water glasses. "Margaret," he said, and the whole table turned to look at him. "We've been talking, all of us. And we've realized something. We've treated you terribly. For years. You've kept this house running, you've taken care of us, and in return, we've been dismissive and cruel. We mocked your faith when we should have been learning from it. And we want to apologize." Victoria spoke next, her voice steady. "We want to do more than apologize. We want to do something to show you that we mean it." Margaret stood holding the water pitcher, her eyes wide with surprise. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Vanessa reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope, which she handed to Margaret. "We know you haven't been home in 6 years. We know you send money to your family every month, which means you never have enough left for a plane ticket. So we bought you one. Round trip to Taiwan. 2 weeks. And we're giving you the time off with full pay." Margaret's hands trembled as she took the envelope. She opened it and saw the ticket inside, saw her name printed on it, saw the departure date of December 23rd, just 3 days away. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she could not stop them. "We're also giving you a raise," Richard added. "A substantial one. And we're setting up a fund to help your sister with your brother-in-law's medical expenses. It's not enough to make up for how we've treated you, but it's a start." Margaret could not speak. She clutched the envelope to her chest and wept, her whole body shaking with the force of emotion too long suppressed. Olivia got up from her chair and came around the table, wrapping her arms around Margaret in a hug. Victoria followed, then Vanessa, then Richard, until the whole family was gathered around this woman who had served them so faithfully, who had prayed for them even when they mocked her, who had shown them through her example what it meant to love without condition. When Margaret finally found her voice, it was thick with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you. You don't know what this means." "We're beginning to understand," Victoria said softly. "You've been teaching us, whether you knew it or not. You've shown us what it looks like to have faith, to have grace, to have peace in the midst of hardship. And we're trying to learn." That night, after the family had gone to bed, Margaret knelt in her small room and prayed with more gratitude than she had ever felt in her life. Her prayers had been answered, not in the way she had expected, not through some dramatic miracle, but through the slow transformation of human hearts. The family that had once mocked her now saw her wisdom. The people who had treated her as invisible now saw her as essential. And she was going home, going to hold her sister, going to meet her nephew's wife, going to see her niece in person for the first time in years. She prayed for the Whitmores, asking God to continue His work in their hearts, to help them hold on to this new softness they had found. She prayed for her own family, thanking God for keeping them safe and healthy. And she prayed for herself, asking for wisdom and strength to continue serving with love, to continue being an example of faith in a world that so desperately needed it. Outside, snow began to fall, the first snow of the season, covering the grounds of the Whitmore estate in a blanket of white. Inside, 5 people slept more peacefully than they had in years, each one changed by the simple power of one woman's persistent prayers and the God who had heard them all along. The airport terminal buzzed with the chaotic energy of holiday travelers, people rushing toward gates with overstuffed luggage, families reuniting with tears and embraces, announcements echoing across the vast space in multiple languages. Margaret stood near the security checkpoint, her small suitcase at her feet, her hands clutching the passport that would carry her home after 6 long years of absence. The Whitmore family stood with her, an unusual sight that drew curious glances from passers-by. A wealthy family seeing off their housekeeper as though she were one of their own. Richard checked his watch for the 3rd time. "You have plenty of time before boarding. But you should probably head through security soon. The lines are getting longer." Margaret nodded but made no move toward the checkpoint. She was trying to memorize this moment, this impossible culmination of prayers she had whispered into the darkness for years. Part of her still could not believe it was real, that she was actually going home, that the family who had once mocked her faith now stood before her with genuine affection in their eyes. Olivia stepped forward, pulling something from her backpack. "I made you something," she said shyly, handing Margaret a small package wrapped in simple brown paper. "It's not much. Just open it on the plane." Margaret took the gift with trembling hands, holding it as though it were made of glass. "Thank you, sweetheart. You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," Olivia said, and her voice was different from the bored, entitled tone Margaret had grown accustomed to over the years. There was sincerity in it now, a softness that had not existed before. "You've taught me more in the last few weeks than I learned in 16 years. I just wanted you to know that." Vanessa surprised everyone, including herself, by pulling Margaret into a tight embrace. "Come back to us," she whispered into Margaret's ear. "We need you. Not as a housekeeper. As family." When Vanessa released her, Victoria stepped forward. The older woman's composure was as perfect as ever, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You have given us an extraordinary gift, Margaret. You showed us what it means to live with grace. We will never forget that." Richard was last. He extended his hand formally, then seemed to change his mind and pulled Margaret into an awkward but heartfelt hug. "Thank you for not giving up on us. Thank you for praying even when we didn't deserve it. Have a wonderful time with your family. And Margaret? When you come back, things are going to be different. I promise you that. Margaret's vision blurred with tears. She looked at each of their faces, seeing the transformation that had taken root in such a short time. They were not perfect. They still had work to do, patterns to break, lessons to learn. But they had taken the first steps, and that was everything. I will pray for you every day while I'm gone, Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. I will thank God for the change He has worked in your hearts. And I will ask Him to continue guiding you. She picked up her suitcase and turned toward the security line. Before she entered, she looked back one more time. The Whitmore family stood together, waving, and in that moment they looked less like the cold, fractured group she had served for 8 years and more like a real family beginning to discover what love meant. The flight was long, crossing half the world from Connecticut to Taipei. Margaret sat by the window, watching clouds drift beneath the plane like cotton fields, her mind wandering between past and present. She thought about the young woman she had been when she first came to America, full of hope and naivety, believing that everything would work out if she just tried hard enough. She thought about the years of struggle that followed, the loneliness, the exhaustion, the nights when she cried herself to sleep wondering if God had forgotten her. But God had not forgotten. He had been there all along, working in ways she could not see, preparing her for a purpose she had not understood. Her suffering had not been meaningless. It had shaped her, softened her, taught her compassion and patience. And now, somehow, it had become the very thing that opened the hearts of people who seemed unreachable. She remembered Olivia's gift and carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a handmade card, the front decorated with pressed flowers and careful lettering. Margaret opened it and read the message written in Olivia's neat script. Dear Margaret, I don't really know how to say this, so I'm just going to try. For most of my life, I thought being a Whitmore meant I was better than other people. I thought our money and our name made us special. But you showed me that real worth has nothing to do with what you have and everything to do with who you are. You are one of the kindest, strongest, most faithful people I have ever known. You work harder than anyone I've met and you never complain. You pray for people who hurt you and you keep loving even when it would be easier to hate. I want to be like you. Not a housekeeper, I mean, but the kind of person who makes the world better just by being in it. Thank you for not hating us when you had every reason to. Thank you for showing me what real grace looks like. I hope Taiwan is everything you've been dreaming of. Love, Olivia. Margaret read the card 3 times, each word settling into her heart like a stone dropping into still water, creating ripples that spread outward. She tucked the card carefully into her purse and closed her eyes, whispering a prayer of gratitude for the miracle of changed hearts. When the plane finally touched down in Taipei, Margaret's hands shook as she gathered her belongings. The airport was familiar and foreign all at once, the signs and characters she had not seen in years, the sound of Mandarin filling the air like music. She moved through customs in a daze, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. And then she saw them. Her sister Lynn stood at the arrival's gate, gray streaking through her dark hair, lines of worry and joy etched around her eyes. Beside her were her children, no longer children but adults. Wei, her nephew, now 24 and married, stood with his arm around a young woman Margaret had never met. May, her niece, was 22, wearing her university graduation robe over casual clothes, having come straight from her ceremony to the airport. Lynn saw Margaret first. Her face crumpled and she ran forward, breaking through the crowd of waiting people, pulling Margaret into an embrace so fierce it drove the breath from both their lungs. They held each other and sobbed, 6 years of separation pouring out in tears that fell onto each other's shoulders, soaking into fabric and skin. You're here, Lynn kept saying, her voice breaking. You're really here. I thought this day would never come. I'm here, Margaret managed between sobs. I'm home. The children wrapped their arms around both women, creating a circle of family that had been broken for too long and was now, finally, whole again. Other travelers moved around them, some smiling at the reunion, some wiping their own eyes. When they finally pulled apart, all of them were laughing through their tears, talking over each other, trying to fit 6 years of life into the first 5 minutes. Lynn drove them to the small apartment where she still lived, the same place Margaret had grown up. The neighborhood had changed, new buildings rising where old ones had stood, but the essence remained. The night market down the street still filled the evening air with the smell of grilled meat and sweet pastries. The temple on the corner still rang its bells at sunset. The sounds of motorbikes and vendors and families eating dinner together still created the symphony that was home. Inside the apartment, everything was exactly as Margaret remembered. The same worn couch where her father used to read his newspaper. The same kitchen table where her mother had taught her to make dumplings. The same view from the window of the building across the street, laundry hanging from balconies like colorful flags. Lynn had prepared a feast, more food than they could possibly eat, spread across every surface of the small kitchen. There was beef noodle soup, Margaret's favorite, and Lou Roe fan, and countless side dishes that represented hours of careful preparation. They sat around the table and ate until they were uncomfortably full, and then they ate more, because this was how love was expressed in their family, through food and togetherness in the simple act of sharing a meal. As they ate, they talked. Wei told Margaret about his wife, Chen, who worked as a teacher and who looked at him with such obvious adoration that it made Margaret's heart swell. May talked about her degree in social work, her plans to help elderly people in their community who had no family to care for them. Lynn talked about her husband's diabetes, how they were managing it, how the money Margaret sent had made it possible for him to afford his medication and regular doctor visits. "Your sacrifice has kept us alive," Lynn said, reaching across the table to squeeze Margaret's hand. "We know what you gave up to help us. We know you stayed in America longer than you wanted, that you worked yourself to exhaustion. And we can never repay that debt." Margaret shook her head firmly. "There is no debt. Family takes care of family. That's what we do." Still, Lynn insisted, her eyes serious. "You gave us everything. And I want you to know that it wasn't wasted. Look at my children. Wei has a good job and a loving wife. May is going to make such a difference in people's lives. They turned out well, Margaret. You helped make that possible." That night, Margaret slept in her old room, barely changed since she had left. Her childhood bed, the small desk where she had studied, the window that looked out over the alley behind the building. She lay in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the neighborhood, and felt a peace so complete it was almost painful in its intensity. The 2 weeks in Taiwan passed in a blur of joy. Margaret and Lynn spent hours talking, filling in the gaps of years apart. They visited their parents' graves, bringing flowers and incense, kneeling together in the quiet cemetery and speaking to the spirits of the people who had given them life. Margaret felt her mother's presence so strongly in those moments that she could almost hear her voice, approving, encouraging, proud. Wei and Chen took Margaret to their small apartment and showed her the nursery they were preparing. "We wanted to wait to tell everyone until you were here," Chen said shyly. "I'm 3 months pregnant. You're going to be a great aunt." Margaret burst into tears of joy, embracing them both, thanking God for this new life, this new generation that would carry their family forward. She placed her hand on Chen's still flat belly and whispered a prayer of blessing over the child growing there. May took Margaret to the community center where she volunteered, introducing her to the elderly people she served. Margaret spent an afternoon there, talking to men and women who reminded her of herself, people who had worked hard their entire lives and were now facing their final years with varying degrees of loneliness and struggle. She held their hands, listened to their stories, and prayed with those who wanted prayer. Watching her niece move among these people with such compassion and skill, Margaret understood that her own life of service had not been in vain. She had passed something important to the next generation, not through her presence but through her example. The days were full, but the nights were quiet and reflective. Margaret would sit by the window in her old room, looking out at the city she had left behind, thinking about the life she had built in America and the life she had left in Taiwan. For years, she had felt torn between two worlds, never quite belonging in either. But now, she realized that she belonged to both. She was Taiwanese and American, rooted in the past and growing toward the future, shaped by loss and enriched by love. On her last night in Taiwan, the whole family gathered for dinner one final time. Lynn had invited extended relatives, cousins and aunts and uncles that Margaret had not seen in years. The small apartment was packed with people, loud with conversation and laughter. They ate and told stories and shared memories of those who were no longer with them. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Lynn pulled Margaret aside. "I need to tell you something," Lynn said quietly. "The money the Whitmores are sending for my husband's medication, it's more than we need. Much more. So I've been saving the extra. And I want you to have it." Margaret started to protest, but Lynn held up her hand. "Listen to me. You've given us everything for 6 years. Now it's time for you to have something for yourself. Take this money. Maybe use it to come home more often. Or save it for your retirement. Or do whatever you want with it. But please, let us give back to you for once." Lynn pressed an envelope into Margaret's hands, and when Margaret opened it later that night, she found enough money to pay for another trip home within the year. She sat on her childhood bed and wept, overwhelmed by the generosity, by the fullness of blessings that seemed to pour into her life from every direction. The return flight to America was bittersweet. Margaret was sad to leave her family again, but this time the separation felt different. It was not the desperate, aching goodbye of someone who did not know when or if she would return. It was the temporary parting of people who knew they would see each other again soon. The burden of impossible distance had been lifted, and in its place was the hope of regular connection. When she arrived back in Connecticut, the Whitmore family picked her up from the airport. They piled into the car together, everyone talking at once, asking about her trip, wanting to hear every detail. The drive home felt warmer than any drive she had taken with them before. Back at the estate, Margaret discovered that her room above the garage had been completely renovated. The Whitmores had hired contractors while she was away, installing new flooring, painting the walls a soft cream color, adding a comfortable reading chair and better lighting. There was a new bed with a quality mattress, soft linens, warm blankets. The small bathroom had been updated with fresh tile and a rainfall showerhead. It was still modest, but it was comfortable in a way it had never been before. "This is too much," Margaret protested, looking around in amazement. "It's not enough," Victoria said firmly. "But it's a start. You deserve to live somewhere comfortable. You deserve to have space that feels like home." Over the following weeks, the changes in the Whitmore household became more evident. Richard had restructured his work life, making family dinner a priority 3 nights a week. He was more present, more engaged, asking questions and actually listening to the answers. His financial situation had stabilized not through any miracle, but through humility. He had sought advice from people he previously considered beneath him, had admitted his mistakes, had worked to rebuild trust with colleagues and clients. The process was slow, but there was progress. Victoria had started attending a weekly prayer group at a local church, something that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. She was still learning, still struggling with the vulnerability that faith required, but she kept showing up. She had also begun volunteering at a food bank, serving meals to people experiencing homelessness. The work humbled her in ways nothing else ever had, forcing her to confront her own privilege in the systems that created such vast inequality. Vanessa had reconnected with a few old friends, but this time she approached relationships differently. She was more honest, more willing to show weakness, less concerned with maintaining a perfect image. Some friendships could not be salvaged, too much damage had been done, but others deepened in unexpected ways. She had also started therapy, working through the insecurities and need for external validation that had driven so much of her behavior. Olivia had thrown herself into her studies with a determination that surprised everyone, including herself. She was not getting perfect grades overnight, years of poor habits could not be undone in weeks, but she was improving. More importantly, she was learning to value effort over outcome, to see mistakes as opportunities rather than failures. She had started volunteering at the community center where May worked, video chatting with her to learn better practices for serving vulnerable populations. One evening in late January, the whole family gathered in the living room after dinner. It was Richard's idea, this new tradition of spending time together without screens or distractions, just talking and being present with one another. Margaret had been invited to join them, no longer relegated to the kitchen or her room but welcomed into the family spaces as an equal. Richard cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "I've been thinking about something Margaret said to me back in December. She told me that prayer was just talking honestly to someone who loved you. And I realized that we've never really talked honestly with each other in this family. We've performed and criticized and maintained distance, but we've never been real." He looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes. "So I want to try something. I want us to each share one thing we're struggling with and one thing we're grateful for. No judgment. No criticism. Just honesty." There was a long silence. Then Victoria spoke, her voice uncharacteristically tentative. "I'm struggling with letting go of control. I'm discovering that my need to manage everything actually prevented me from experiencing real joy. And I'm grateful for the second chance I've been given. To learn. To grow. To change." Vanessa went next. "I'm struggling with forgiving myself for the person I used to be. For the cruelty I showed to people who didn't deserve it, including everyone in this room. And I'm grateful for Margaret, who showed me that grace is possible even when you think you've gone too far." Olivia's contribution was shorter but no less meaningful. "I'm struggling with being patient with myself as I try to become a better student and a better person. And I'm grateful for this family, for sticking with me even when I was awful." When it was Margaret's turn, she spoke softly but clearly. "I struggle with loneliness sometimes, even surrounded by people. I miss my family every day. But I'm grateful for all of you. For letting me be part of your journey. For teaching me that transformation is always possible if we're willing to be humble enough to change." The conversation continued for over an hour, everyone sharing fears and hopes and struggles and joys. It was messy and awkward at times, but it was real. And in that realness, the family found something they had been missing their entire lives: genuine connection. As February turned into March, the Whitmore estate became a different kind of place. It was still grand, still impressive, but it no longer felt cold. There was laughter in the halls. There were conversations at the dinner table. There was grace for mistakes and celebration for small victories. The house was becoming a home. Margaret continued to work as the housekeeper, but the nature of her work had changed. The Whitmores no longer treated her as invisible help but as a valued member of the household. They asked her opinion on decisions. They included her in family celebrations. They respected her boundaries while also making sure she knew she was welcome in their lives. One Sunday morning in early April, the entire Whitmore family attended church together for the first time. They had asked Margaret which service she attended, and she had taken them to the small community church where she had worshipped alone for 8 years. The congregation was predominantly immigrant families, people who worked hard for modest wages, people who understood struggle in ways the Whitmores never had. When Margaret walked in with the wealthy family trailing behind her, there were shocked faces and whispered conversations. But the pastor, a kind man who had known Margaret's story for years, welcomed them with open arms. The service was simple, the music provided by volunteers rather than professionals, the sermon delivered with passion rather than polish. When it came time for prayer requests, Richard stood up. His voice shook as he spoke. "My family has been transformed by the faith of one of your members. Margaret Chen has worked in our home for 8 years, and we spent most of that time treating her terribly. We mocked her prayers. We dismissed her faith. We thought we were above needing God. But when our own lives fell apart, Margaret was there. She showed us grace we didn't deserve. She taught us how to pray. And through her example, we found something we didn't even know we were missing. So we're here to say thank you. To Margaret, to this community, and to God for not giving up on us." The congregation was silent for a moment. Then someone in the back started clapping. Others joined in, and soon the whole church was on their feet, applauding not the Whitmores, but the God who had worked through Margaret's faithful prayers to bring about such unlikely transformation. After the service, people surrounded the Whitmore family, welcoming them, sharing their own stories of struggle and faith. Victoria found herself in conversation with a woman who worked 2 jobs to support her children. Vanessa talked with a single mother about the challenges of raising teenagers. Olivia sat with a group of young adults discussing college and careers and purpose. Richard spoke with men who had survived business failures and health crises and family tragedies, who had found that losing everything sometimes meant gaining what truly mattered. As they drove home that afternoon, the car was full of reflection and wonder. "That was the most real thing I've experienced in years," Richard said quietly. "Those people have almost nothing compared to us, but they have something we've been missing. They have community. They have purpose. They have joy." Victoria nodded from the passenger seat. "Margaret has been trying to show us that all along. That wealth and status are hollow without love. Without faith. Without connection to something bigger than ourselves." In the back seat, Vanessa looked at Margaret, who sat beside her. "You've given us everything," she said softly. "And we've given you so little in return." Margaret shook her head, smiling. "You've given me more than you know. You've shown me that my prayers mattered. That faith can move mountains, even mountains of pride and privilege. You've given me hope that no one is beyond redemption. That's a gift I'll treasure forever." As the months continued to unfold, the Whitmore family's transformation deepened and spread. Richard began mentoring young professionals from underprivileged backgrounds, using his business knowledge to help others avoid the mistakes he had made. Victoria started a charitable foundation focused on helping immigrant families access education and healthcare. Vanessa volunteered as a counselor for women recovering from addiction, using her own struggles with self-worth to connect with others facing similar battles. Olivia organized fundraisers at her school for various causes, discovering that she had a talent for mobilizing her privileged peers toward meaningful action. And Margaret continued to pray. Every morning before dawn, every evening after dinner, she knelt and talked to the God who had heard her all along. She prayed for the Whitmore family, for her own family in Taiwan, for the community at her church, for a world that desperately needed more love and less judgment. Her prayers were not complicated or eloquent. They were simple conversations with a friend who never failed to listen. 1 year after that December when everything changed, the Whitmore family threw Margaret a birthday party. It was not just the family this time, but the whole church community, co-workers of Richard's who had been impacted by his transformation, neighbors who had noticed the change in the household, even some of Olivia's friends who wanted to meet the woman who had inspired such growth. The backyard of the estate was filled with people, laughter, music. There was food from Margaret's home country and food from Connecticut, a blend of cultures coming together in celebration. When it came time to cut the cake, a beautiful 3-tiered creation that bore no resemblance to the single cupcake from a year ago, Victoria called for everyone's attention. 1 year ago, Victoria said, her voice carrying across the crowd, Margaret sat alone in our kitchen with a tiny cupcake, making a wish that she would not have to be alone anymore. We knew about it because we had been watching her pray, mocking her faith, treating her devotion as entertainment. We were cruel and arrogant and blind. But Margaret did not stop praying for us. Even when we gave her every reason to hate us, she continued to ask God to bless our family. And God answered her prayers, not by changing our circumstances, but by changing our hearts. She paused, emotion making her voice thick. Margaret taught us that real wealth has nothing to do with money. That real strength comes from humility. That real joy comes from faith and service and love. She taught us these things not through words, but through the way she lived every single day. And we are better people because of her. The crowd erupted in applause, and Margaret stood in the center of it all, tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the evidence of answered prayers. She looked around at the faces surrounding her, Whitmores and church members and strangers who had become friends, and she understood that this was the miracle she had been praying for all along. Not wealth or comfort or an easy life, but connection. Community. Love that transcended differences in culture and class and background. A family not of blood but of choice, bound together by faith and grace and the willingness to change. As the sun set over the estate, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Margaret closed her eyes and offered a prayer of gratitude so deep that words seemed inadequate. But God, who had always heard her prayers, understood what her heart could not articulate. And in the gathering dusk, surrounded by people who loved her, Margaret Chen finally had the answer to the wish she had made 1 year ago over a solitary cupcake. She would never be alone again. 3 years had passed since that transformative December, and the Whitmore estate had become something none of them could have imagined. The grand house now served a dual purpose, still home to the family, but also a gathering place for the community Margaret had introduced them to. Every other Saturday, the spacious dining room hosted free English classes for immigrants. The library had become a tutoring center where Olivia and other volunteers helped underprivileged students with homework. The vast backyard, once pristine and unused, now held community dinners where people from every background shared meals and stories. Margaret no longer lived above the garage. The Whitmores had insisted she move into one of the guest suites in the main house, a spacious room with its own bathroom and a view of the garden she had always tended but never truly enjoyed. She had resisted at first, uncomfortable with such luxury, but Victoria had been firm. "You are family now. Family does not live above the garage." Richard had taken early retirement from finance, using his wealth and connections to start a non-profit organization that provided microloans to immigrant entrepreneurs. He spent his days meeting with people who reminded him of Margaret, hardworking individuals with dreams but no capital, and he helped turn those dreams into reality. The work fulfilled him in ways that moving money around for profit never had. Victoria had become a regular speaker at churches and community centers, sharing her testimony of transformation. She spoke about privilege and blindness, about how easy it was to miss the sacred in the ordinary, about how a housekeeper's faithful prayers had saved her soul. Her honesty and vulnerability drew crowds, and she used her platform to raise awareness and funds for causes that serve the marginalized. Vanessa had gone back to school, earning a degree in social work. She now worked at a shelter for women escaping domestic violence, using her own journey from superficiality to substance to connect with women rebuilding their lives. The work was hard and often heartbreaking, but it gave her purpose that shopping and social climbing never could. Olivia had graduated high school with grades good enough to get into a solid state university, where she majored in nonprofit management. She spent her summers interning with organizations that served vulnerable populations, and she had already started planning her own initiative to help children of immigrant families navigate the American education system. On a crisp autumn morning, Margaret received a phone call that made her hands shake. Her sister Lynn was on the line, voice trembling with joy. "Margaret Chen gave birth last night. A healthy baby girl. They named her after you. Her English name is Margaret." Margaret sat down heavily, tears streaming down her face. She had visited Taiwan twice more since that first trip, and each reunion had been sweet, but this news filled her with a joy she had not anticipated. To have a child named after her, to know that her legacy would continue in this new life, felt like a blessing beyond measure. The Whitmores immediately arranged for her to fly home for a month to help with the new baby. When Margaret protested that it was too long to be away, Richard simply smiled. "Margaret, you have given us years of your life. Take all the time you need. Your job will be waiting, but more than that, your family here will be waiting. Because that is what we are now. Family." During that month in Taiwan, Margaret held her tiny namesake and whispered prayers over her, the same prayers her own mother had whispered over her decades ago. She taught Chen traditional songs and showed her how to make the special rice porridge her mother had made. She sat with Lynn late into the night, talking about their parents, about faith, about the strange and wonderful way God had woven their lives into something beautiful despite all the pain. When she returned to Connecticut, the entire Whitmore household was waiting at the airport with a banner that read "Welcome home, Margaret." Olivia had brought flowers. Vanessa had baked a cake, slightly lopsided but made with genuine love. Victoria held a photo album she had compiled of all the community events that had happened in Margaret's absence. Richard simply pulled her into a hug and said, "We missed you terribly." That evening, as they sat around the dinner table sharing a meal, Margaret looked at each face and marveled at the miracle of it all. These people who had once mocked her prayers now bowed their heads and took turns thanking God for the food, for each other, for the chance to live with purpose. The transformation was complete not because they were perfect, they still struggled and made mistakes, but because they had learned humility. They had learned that wealth without compassion was poverty. That power without service was weakness. That a life lived only for oneself was not really living at all. As the years continued to unfold, Margaret's influence rippled outward in ways she never sought but could not deny. The community center that had started in the Whitmore home expanded, eventually moving to a building downtown that Richard purchased and renovated. Hundreds of people passed through its doors each week, finding English classes, job training, legal assistance, and most importantly, a community that saw them and valued them. Margaret remained humble through it all, insisting she had simply prayed and God had done the rest. But everyone who knew her story understood the truth. Her prayers had been powerful not because she had used the right words or prayed long enough, but because they had been backed by a life of faithful service. She had loved when it was hard. She had forgiven when it was costly. She had believed when circumstances suggested she was foolish to do so. And in doing all of that, she had become a living answer to her own prayers. On Margaret's 60th birthday, the community threw a celebration that filled the entire center. There were speeches and tears and laughter. Former students shared how her encouragement had helped them graduate. Immigrant families talked about how the resources she had connected them with had changed their trajectories. The Whitmores spoke about how a woman they had once dismissed had become the most important person in their lives. When it was Margaret's turn to speak, she stood before the crowd with characteristic modesty. "I am just one person," she said softly. "I did not do anything extraordinary. I simply talked to God every day and tried to love the people He put in my path. If my life has meant anything, it is only because God took my small offerings and multiplied them beyond what I could imagine." She paused, looking around at the sea of faces, brown and white and black, young and old, wealthy and struggling. "This is what I prayed for all those years ago. Not wealth or fame or comfort. I prayed that I would not be alone. And look at what God has given me. A family that spans continents and cultures. A community bound not by blood but by love. A life that matters not because of what I have, but because of who we have become together." The room erupted in applause, but Margaret simply smiled and sat down, uncomfortable with attention, grateful only for the chance to have been used by God in ways she never expected. As the celebration continued around her, she closed her eyes and offered a silent prayer of thanks, the same kind of simple, honest prayer she had been praying for decades. And somewhere in the mystery of the universe, God smiled and said, "Well done, my faithful servant. Well done." Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.